Our text today comes from the book of Exodus, starting in the 20th verse, starting the 20th chapter, starting in verse 1. Listen now. So a little bit of a longer text, so hang with me. I think it'll be a little familiar, so that will help. But I wanted to expand it to include the whole of the story. Exodus chapter 20, starting in verse 1. Then God spoke these words, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And you shall have no gods before me. You shall not make yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the sea. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of their parents to the third and fourth generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God. For the Lord will not acquit someone who misuses God's name. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But on the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. You, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. Honor your father and your mother, so that your days may be long in the land, and that your Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or male or female slave, or ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. When all the people witnessed the thunder and the lightning, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking, they were afraid, and they trembled and stood at a distance and said to Moses, You speak to us and we will listen, but do not let God to speak to us, or we will die. Moses said to the people, Do not be afraid, for God has only come to test you and put the fear of him upon you, so that you do not sin. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. I have a confession to make. I am a total sucker for reality TV. I always get drawn into the stories, into the drama, into the lives of people I don't even know. I say to myself, I'm just going to watch one episode, see what it's all about, and before you know it, I'm following everybody on Instagram. In fact, I'm currently counting down the days until the long-awaited new season of The Bachelorette begins. Only 9 days for those who are keeping track. I know it's all very silly, and it's not actually all that real, as the name reality would suggest. But what can I say? It's my guilty pleasure. A new show that I have recently begun watching is a show called Married at First Sight. And it's exactly what it sounds like. In this show, 4 couples are married to each other without ever meeting their spouse. In fact, it is at the altar in front of all of their friends and families that they even learn their spouse's name. Now, their spouses aren't completely random people. There are 4 experts, ranging from sociologists to pastors to relation therapists, who spend many painstaking weeks trying to find the most compatible person for each participant. After the wedding, to a complete stranger. They go on their honeymoon and they move in together. Then they have 2 months to decide if they want to remain married. And over those 2 months, the experts meet with the couples, give them activities to do together, and set up guidelines for the way to make this work. The show makers call this a social experiment. I call it quality TV. And while I can acknowledge that the premise of this show is rather ridiculous, as I'm watching the show, I'm beginning to see a pattern emerge. The pattern is that the couples who take the advice of the experts seriously, who are willing to participate in the activities they are given, and who closely follow the rules of the show, tend to be the couples that are the most successful. On the other hand, the couples who are resistant to the advice, who don't want to do the activities, or who straight up ignore the rules of the show because they want to do their own thing, or they don't want to be told what to do, tend to be less likely to stay together after the 2 months. And of course, this is because the rules and guidelines that the experts have set up were never meant to be oppressive or controlling. The rules and guidelines are created to foster a healthy relationship between the couple. The rules and guidelines are created to foster growth, to foster connection, to make space for love to grow. I think when we hear commandments, we are tempted to think of them as a list of rules. And in some ways, they are a list of rules. But the rules aren't the kind of rules that are given to oppress us or control us, or even to make us feel guilty. Rather, they are like the advice of the experts on Married at First Sight. They are given to foster community, to remind the people that they have been liberated, and yes, to make space for love to grow. I am sure when I began reading our text today, most of you thought, yes, this is the Sunday that we read the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments are rather widely well known as the 10 big rules that God has given to the people of Israel via Moses. The 10 Commandments are generally thought of as pretty good and reasonable rules for living. In fact, I can't think of any major religions or moral codes that would take issue with these rules. We generally agree murder is not great. We shouldn't steal. Do not commit adultery. We're okay with these rules. And if I read this text and you heard the text today and you went home and you said, you know what? I'm going to work on taking these commandments a little more seriously this week. I'm going to try and not covet my neighbor's donkey, or maybe in our case, fancy car, then that's not a bad way to leave this worship service. However, I think that if we look closely at the text, we will find that this is not just a list of rules, that it's actually a text that is rich, that tells us more about who we are and about who God is. We will see that the commandments is fundamentally about radical commitment to God and compassion for neighbors. That the commandments are intended to form the character of community by cultivating a deep and enduring love for and loyalty to God, which then extends to all of our creation. Now, usually when we see the 10 Commandments displayed or posted somewhere, it isn't displayed or posted with the whole story. You don't see the rest of the text, which is a shame because to really appreciate this list of rules, we must understand that God gives Moses the 10 Commandments in part of a larger, wider, deeper narrative that spans across the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Now, they probably can't display all 5 books and all the words of all 5 books, but I think that we can lean into it. By the time we come to Moses going up into the mountain and receiving these commandments, the people of Israel and God have gone through a lot together. God has anointed Moses to be their leader. God has brought the people out of slavery in Egypt. God has parted the Red Sea. God has made a covenant or a sacred promise to bring the people into a new land full of milk and honey. God has fed the people in the wilderness. The people have struggled with God. They have journeyed with God. They have trusted God, and they have doubted God. This is no 10 Commandments at first sight. These 10 Commandments are given to the people to help them, to guide them along their journey. And at the very heart of these commandments is liberation. God reminds the people in verse 2 that they have been delivered from Egypt, that they are no longer slaves. The people should know that they have every reason to trust that God has their best interest at heart. God presents these 10 Commandments as an alternative to life in Egypt, as an invitation to a new kind of community. God offers the wandering people a new way of life, one that begins with love for God and ends with love for neighbor. In Egypt, under the oppression of slavery, they did not have enough. They did not live in a good community. But in God's liberation, there is enough. And good community, good, loving community is possible. It's like God is reminding the Israelites, you are no longer slaves. Don't live like slaves. Imagine God saying, you are a liberated people. Live like a liberated people. Liberated people have room to rest and to keep the Sabbath holy. Liberated people have abundance, so there is no need to covet what your neighbors have or to steal what you need. Liberated people can live in peace and turn away from the allure of violence. Liberated people don't live under the oppressive rule of another. They live in loving communities with one another. Scholar Amy Erickson says, quote, the commandments are not simply a list of rules given to whip into shape a stiff-necked people. Instead, they are better viewed as a means to form and nurture alternative community, bound not by the common goals of wealth and prestige, but rather by loyalty to a God who has chosen to redeem a group of slaves from the life of bondage. She writes, the commandments mean to sketch out space where human beings can live fruitful, productive, and meaningful lives before God and with one another. End quote. Erickson gets it exactly right. The commandments that God lays out for the people is meant to be a source of community, to bring people together, to foster that love between them. This love extends from God, the people's love and trust in God. God is telling the people, remember, you are no longer bound by slavery. You no longer belong to the Egyptians, but you now belong to God, and you are bound lovingly to one another. And of course, this bond to God and neighbors comes with responsibilities. When we are bound to one another, we are responsible for honoring one another. We are responsible to commit to the life and well-being of all. We're responsible to seeing that all have what they need. We're responsible to resting so that we can do the hard work of loving and creating. We are responsible to worship God first and foremost. So friends, I ask this question. Are we living like a liberated people? And I don't mean, do we check off all of the 10 Commandments perfectly? I mean, do we live like people who strive for life? Do we live like people who trust in God's provision? Do we live like people who have who desire the best for those around us? Do we live with radical compassion? Most importantly, do we live lives that begin with love for God and end with love for our neighbor? Amen.